Hey, Connect friends and family, welcome to the Overtime. Who doesn't love overtime? Anytime you're watching a game, that means you get to watch that much more of a game. Well, actually, my wife hates overtime. I was watching a football game the other day and there was about a minute left in the fourth quarter and she said, how much time's left in the game so we could watch something else? And I said, only 1 minute. She's like, okay, I guess I can handle that. And then she got up and went down the hall. She heard me scream. She came back and she said, it's overtime, isn't it? I'm like, yeah. So the overtime is all about the fact that we've gone to 4 services, and so I've had to trim up the messages a little bit more. These are some of the fun things and some of the interesting things and some of the life-changing things that we didn't have time to talk about on Sunday morning. I want to start off with 3 things that I thought were kind of funny, honestly. One of them is this new series is called Choose Your Own Adventure. And so when we were making a graphic, I drew like a really awkward picture of the Choose Your Own Adventure front of a book, and I sent it to our graphics team and I said, hey, what can you do with this? So I wanted to show it to you. I thought you'd get a kick out of it. Choose your adventure, Christ or culture. And so you've got the banner up here, and then you got your choices, right? So you've got your crown of thorns. This is supposed to be an earthly crown. You've got an ichthus here, you've got an LGBTQ flag, which is kind of a symbol of our culture today. You've got a cross, and then you've got what looks like Perry the Platypus, but it's actually supposed to be Molech. And then you've got Elisha. There he is, he's bald, and he is watching Elijah go up into the sky in his chariot of fire. And look at Elijah's detail work there. He's wearing his shirt that's made of hair, and he's got his beard, and he's kind of a rough-looking character. Anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of that. So that was one thing that was kind of funny. Another thing that I thought was fun is just the idea that it's pretty clear that Elijah was not a designer clothing guy. He was definitely more of a Goodwill or a Dollar General shopper, because when some of Ahaziah's messengers went down there and Elijah intercepted them, they came back and they talked to Ahaziah and they described him as this rough-looking guy that was wearing a coat made of hair and a leather belt. And Ahaziah's like, oh, it's that guy. It's Elijah. So I thought that was kind of fun because, Ahaziah had probably heard story after story about how much his parents hated Elijah, his parents being Ahab and Jezebel. Another thing that I thought was funny is the fire from heaven trick. Ahaziah sends soldiers down the first time. Elijah brings down fire from heaven. He sends them down a second time. Elijah brings down fire from heaven. And there is a time that's 800 and something years later when the disciples are frustrated because the Samaritans have rejected Jesus and the message of Jesus. And the disciples actually ask the question, Jesus, should we call fire down from heaven like Elijah? And I just thought that was kind of funny. I think if any of us try to call down fire from heaven, I don't think it's going to work very well. So those are 3 funny things. But here are a couple things that I thought were really useful and helpful in my own discipleship. The first thing is that I just wanted to take a minute and just point out that Elisha really did leave a lot behind to follow God. He was 15 years old. It said he was out plowing in the fields, which meant that he had land, he had a family, and he probably had a pretty nice inheritance. But at the age of 15, he decided to leave it all to follow God. And I think that's really pretty incredible. I think it's a great example for us that even at a young age, we can choose to follow God, and God's blessings will follow us, because when we submit to God's way, it brings rich blessings. But when we get into God's way, it brings steep consequences. The second thing is that Elisha was incredibly loyal to Elijah, who is not his physical father, but who is his spiritual father. And it says this in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. It says, now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. So this happens in verse 1 and 2, but then later on, Elijah gives the same type of advice to say, Elisha, I've got a couple things I've got to do, and you stay here, I'm going to go. And both times Elisha is like, no, where you go, I will go. Elisha was a very loyal mentee or friend or spiritual son to Elijah. And I think that that's a great example for us to be loyal friends. Another thing I learned is that Elisha was part of some type of a ministry school. And this ministry school was called the Sons of the Prophets. And back during this culture, you could actually be mentored at the age of 13 and could have been considered someone's disciple at the age of 15. And I thought that is a really cool succession plan for leadership. And that's really something as moms and dads, like you should have some expectation of your kids to get serious mentoring and take their faith seriously at 13 and really take big steps in their faith, even at the age of 15, because we know that Elisha's ministry started just at the age of 20. I think that's pretty incredible. Now, speaking of this ministry school, these sons of the prophets, they were just teenagers. And as teenagers, they like to talk and maybe gossip a little bit. And maybe they like to talk a little bit out of hand. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "And the sons of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? And he said, yes, I know. Keep quiet." Now, why would Elisha have told them to keep quiet? It seems like they were giving him useful information. They were telling Elisha that Elijah today is going to be taken up into the heavens and he's going to leave. These sons of the prophets wanted to make sure that Elisha had that news. Well, Elisha already had that news. If anyone was close to Elijah, it was Elisha, so he didn't need to hear it. But it didn't just happen in this verse, it actually happens again in verse 5. Check this out. The sons of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? And he answered, yes, I know. Keep quiet. Today, the young people these days, the Gen Z, you know, when you say something they agree with and they think it's good, they might say something like, yeah, man, say less. And say less means I agree with you and I affirm you. But in this story, when Elisha says, I know, keep quiet, it's not affirming. He wants them to shut their mouths. He's tired of hearing from them. Now, why is that? Well, first off, he already knew because of how close he was to Elijah. Second off, he didn't want to spend a bunch of time talking about what's going to happen. He wanted to be there and he wanted to be present with Elijah in the last moments. And third, the third reason I think he was annoyed is because he was legitimately sad about it and he didn't want to get caught up in his emotions. He wanted to be focused. Then later on, we see how the sons of the prophets stand behind what happens to Elijah and they confirm Elisha after he parts the water. But the fifth thing that I learned that I thought was really cool was how Elisha was used by God to heal thousands just by healing their water source. 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 19 says, now the men of the city said to Elisha, behold, the situation of this city is pleasant, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad, and the land is unfruitful. He said, bring me a new bowl, and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. Then he went to the spring of water and threw salt in it, and said, thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From now on, neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it. So the water has been healed to this day according to the word that Elisha spoke. Now, this town happens to be Jericho, the oldest, if not one of the oldest cities in the history of civilization. Now, today, this spring that they're talking about is currently known as, I believe, the spring of Elisha. And in the spring of Elisha, it pumps out something like 1,000 gallons per minute. Jericho, as a city, has the lowest elevation of any city in the world. It is listed at 840 feet below sea level, but they also have had a very sophisticated form of irrigation and ways to get water from the spring into their city. Here's the problem. The water was bad. And if the water was bad, that means that the crops would not be healthy, the animals would not be healthy, that people would get sick and even die, which is why it specifically mentions death and miscarriages. You know, water is kind of a big deal. Our bodies are 60% water, and if all of that water went bad, we would be in a whole lot of trouble. This is what David has to say about water in Psalm chapter 1, verse 3. It says, "He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yield its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers." How does that tree grow? That tree grows because it is being fed by a fresh stream of water. Water was a big deal back in the Old Testament, but it's also a big deal to Jesus. He says this in John 7:38, "Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said," Jesus says, "out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And as I think about the water that God used Elisha to heal, and all the lives that were changed, and all the babies that were born, and all the crops that were planted and harvested, and animals that lived, and people that lived with great health, I think if you fix the water flowing in, you'll fix everything that's flowing out. And so that makes me think, what's flowing into my life? Because whatever is flowing into my life is what will flow out of my life. And it's my prayer, and I hope it's your prayer as well, that my life is filled with doing things God's way instead of doing things my own way. Because if I submit to God's way, then I will get rich blessings. If I get in God's way, there will be steep consequences. That water will not be healthy. So as you go on with the rest of your week, I want you to consider what kind of water is flowing into your life. Is it life-giving? And then what kind of life is flowing out of you? What kind of living water? Because that, in the presence of God, is how we live productive, godly lives, and how we'll change the world together. I hope you've enjoyed the Overtime. We'll see you next week.